Good evening to all. I'm calling to order the regular meeting of the Ojai Planning Commission for August 1st, 2018. Sherry, could we have a roll call, please?
Chair Quillisi?
Here.
Vice Chair Nolan?
Here.
Commissioners Merck?
Here.
Corbin?
Here.
Jagiello?
Here.
Commissioner Powers is absent and one vacancy.
Thank you. Bobby, would you like to lead us in the pledge?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Next up is public communications, the time set aside during the Planning Commission meeting for members of the public to address the commission on items that are not on the current agenda. If you want to do that, complete a speaker's card, one like this, and we're going to have to do something about how we handle public communications. Maybe move it, because now we're saying get one and file it with the secretary, and we've already started the meeting. But we'll deal with that another time. You should state your name and address for the record, and tell us if you live inside or outside the city of Ojai. Are you a not registered voter, but are you a resident of the city? And limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. And comments must be directed to the commission, not the audience. And while the commission is in session, all in attendance are expected to maintain order and decorum and obey the orders of the chair, especially with the gavel. Great fun. Okay, we have one card for public communications. Is that as well? That's okay. Very good. Chris Hilders, come on down.
Chris Hilgers, 704 Park Road, been a resident since '69. When I got out of the service in the '60s, I went to work at the park, and my boss took a special interest in a certain kind of tree which I thought was interesting, and that was Crocus agrifolia, which is the coast live oak.
Oh.
So he said, well, if you want to learn something about it, you need to buy a book. And I said, what's that? And well, it's a book by William Hertrick, who ran the Huntington Botanic Garden. And over the period of time, and I've been in the grading business over town, I've taken that to heart. And there were a few things that he said I think are apropos to everybody in the city that the Planning Commission might have some influence in. One of them was there were very few things that he really recommended. Number one thing was pruning care. Do not take the top of the tree out because it lets the sunlight in and promotes what they call witch's growth. And that goes all over the tree and eventually leads to the demise of the tree. So his recommendation was, unless you need to take a branch out for safety, or unless you have something that dead wood, it's so because the trees sort of prune themselves, you may do that, and cabling is absolutely acceptable. And I bring to point that the way the trees grow that we're not familiar with is most of the live oaks we see grow rather tall, not to be confused with the valley oak, but they're sort of tall with the first branches starting at 6 feet or higher. And this is because all the oak trees that we see in Southern California have most of them at one time or another been pruned up by the cattle. So this is not the way they really want to grow. If you look down in Miramonte in the open field before you get to the school, there's some examples of the way the trees want to grow, and that's essentially they grow like a big umbrella. And if you go inside them, they make their own area, and they make mulch up to 1 foot of mulch, and they protect themselves from the sunlight, and they really grow like a big bush. But this is not the way that they're treated in most places in Southern California. And the other thing he said was in times of drought, where your tree may be under stress, as we see the trees now, they weren't able to take up the water fast enough, and even in some areas where they had water, so the leaves turned brown because it was an exceptionally hot day. I think that 115 did it. He said that it was absolutely okay to water the trees as if you had a rain event 2 or 3 times a summer. If you wanted to do that, you could put some tin cans out and water around the drip line, and that will make you a tree that you will enjoy because They will last up to 200 years, and you can enjoy them rather than looking them under stress. And if my last point is, if you want to make an example of what not to do with a live oak, take a look at the tree that's east of this building, and it's on a slow decline to the Oak Tree Hospice Hotel. Thanks.
Okay. I had a question, Chris, if you got a minute, and please excuse my ignorance, but I see two kinds of oaks around town. There may be more than that, but there's some with sort of spiky holly-like leaves, and there's some with many lobed leaves. Which one is the valley oak?
Valley oak is the one that grows like a bush along the road. It's the one that grows next to the school and across from the old Ford Agency. And the other one is Quercus lobata. That's a valley oak. It tolerates the heat much better, and it wants to grow more columnar and have a big spread. And as an example of that,
Which one has the spiky leaves?
that would be, I believe that would be lobata.
Agrifolia is the coastline.
Anyway,
Coast live oak, okay.
If you have an oak tree and you don't want to water a lot, if you want to, you can put some cans out and water, and you can emulate a rain event 2, 2, or 3 times a summer. You'd be amazed what it does for the tree. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, is there anyone else that wishes to speak during public communications on an item not on the agenda? All right, then we'll close public communications, and we'll go to the consent item on the calendar. All matters listed on the consent calendar be considered routine by the governing bodies and will be enacted by one motion in the form listed. No discussion of these items unless before the governing body votes on the motion to adopt, specific items are removed from the consent calendar for separate motions. We have one consent item tonight, the minutes of the regular meeting of the Planning Commission of July 18. The recommendation is approval from the staff. Yes, Kath?
I'll make a motion that we adopt the July 18th, 2018 Ojai Planning Commission minutes with one change, and that's right at the top of the page where it says call to order. It actually says Vice Chair Nolan, which is me, but it should say Chair Quillisi.
Yes, we caught that.
Oh, you did
and-
already?
and
Okay, was it
corrected
in
the
mine?
signature copy of the minutes.
Okay, didn't have that on mine, so.
Any other corrections to the minutes? Could we have a motion then?
Just, excuse me, for the record, were there any other changes made other than that change to the signature copy?
None to my knowledge.
That's it.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'll make a motion that we adopt it with the change.
okay,
I'll second the motion.
okay. Any discussion? A roll call, please, Sherry.
Merck,
Yes.
Corbin,
Yes.
Nolan.
Yes.
Quillisi.
Yes.
Jagiello.
Yes.
Excellent, okay. Disclosure of site visits and ex parte contacts. Disclosure by commissioners of site visits and ex parte contacts for items on the agenda. We have one location on the agenda tonight, public hearing item number 2, Boku. The other is a text amendment, doesn't really apply. But Chester? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you speak first.
That's okay. I'm familiar with the property. I've been on the property many times, and but I had no ex parte contact.
Okay. Commissioner Nolan, Vice Chair Nolan, excuse me.
I'm actually going to be representing the applicant, so I'm going to be recusing myself from that item.
Okay, so ex parte contacts would be moot in this case? Yes. Commissioner Corbin?
I visited the site, had no ex parte contacts.
Mr. Merck?
I've been past the site many times and have had no ex parte contacts. I would like to say regarding item 3, I've had a number of discussions with people around town, but no specific ex parte contacts. But it seems like everybody's.
I don't know who we might have an ex parte contact with on
Yeah.
a text amendment.
But
Right.
everybody seems to be talking about it, so.
Yeah, with a legislative item, you're expected to have a number of productive conversations with
One-
constituents.
One would hope we'd
There's
get
no-
some citizen input. Yes.
Exactly. There's no direct ex parte
okay.
contact rule for legislative items like the tiny houses text amendment.
Okay, and I'm also familiar with and have visited the site and had no ex parte contacts. Okay, let's move on to the public hearing items. Item number 2 is the Boku conditional use permit, CUP 18-02, and design review permit, DRP 17-12, for the expansion of an existing use to Boku International, a health food company that processes and packages food products located at 987 West Ojai Avenue. Could we hear from staff first?
Yes, thank you. So this project has previously been before the Planning Commission for a concept review, so it may look familiar. There was a concept review back in June of 2016, and at that time, the minutes for that concept review are attached. And at that time, the Planning Commission gave positive feedback, but couldn't take any action on the actual approvals. So the item is back before the Planning Commission. It's returning for the granting of the conditional use permit and the design review permit to implement the project discussed at the concept review. The CUP, the conditional use permit, involves the applicant, Boku International, intending to use the site at 987 West Ojai Avenue, which is in the C1 General Commercial Zone, as a headquarters, but also to relocate their existing dry powdered food processing, which is maybe not urgent, but a timely need for Boku at this time. Food processing will take place inside the existing facility within a self-contained blending room. For that reason, because of the timeliness, this has been submitted in 2 phases, and only phase 1 is currently before you. Phase 1 includes installation of the room for the assembly and storage of the dry powdered food products, offering of a no-fee community exercise class Monday through Friday, 7 to 8 a.m. or 6 to 7 p.m. For up to 18 students max. Installation of a new window on the warehouse for the employee office, e-bike rentals for up to 30 bikes with overnight storage, approval of a post and rail fence installed to secure the rental bikes, approval of landscaping, including new landscaping at the base of the light poles, installation of 4 palm trees and removal of existing turf, and installation of a custom weather vane. There is going to be a second phase of the project, but those items aren't being
Not an issue.
approved at this point. And that's all.
Okay, any questions for staff?
I have a question. Mr. Vega, my recollection of the concept review we did earlier was that we discussed that there really actually isn't any food processing per se on this site. It's more assembly, and I just wanted to make sure that's clear. There's no preparation of food or anything like that.
Yes, so per the code, processing and packaging is considered part of that processing, but it is, I mean, it's indisputably, it's not, the same amount of waste or anything else that you would typically expect. One challenge we had with it is that in that zone, some of the other uses that aren't typically allowed, one of them is fruit and vegetable shipping, which is perhaps more similar to this use, but those aren't allowed as a primary use. And so what we're looking at here is an ancillary use to the headquarters.
Thank you.
Commissioner Corbin?
Well, I had a query about your description of this as an ancillary use, because without the processing of this product, there is no company. And so it is, in fact, the main focus is to produce the product and not the headquarters itself. So I don't think it falls under your category of grocery store, where the grocery store could have nothing in storage and still be selling everything that's in the grocery store. I think that this is the main function of this building. And I also had a question about exactly what the processing involved. And I'd like perhaps if the customer or the client could,
Applicant, yeah.
the applicant, excuse me, could clarify exactly what the processing is. Do you get the powder from somebody else? Do you make the powder? What exactly is the process?
Okay.
And I can address the first part of that if you'll allow me quickly. So we did note that in the current configuration, it is, not clear that the packaging is not the primary use. And so that was why we noted that there's 2 phases. By the end of the second phase, there's going to be several uses, and the overall idea with the project is to make it this, attraction essentially, which fits within that commercial tourist serving zone. So we did note that in our report that, and that's why we included the second phase, even though it's not an issue, and the sunset within the permit that would say if the second phase items do not get completed, it would have to come back at some point, or the permit would lapse because it's
The CUP for
primary
the
use.
Phase 1 items would be revoked?
So the CUP would expire on yeah. It would be, it could be rescinded by February 1st, 2019 if Phase 2 hasn't begun.
And if I could add just a brief additional comment, that's baked into condition number 2 on page 4 of 9 of attachment A, and we've structured it to be reasonable. So the requirement is that the applicant must submit by February 1st, 2019, the necessary applications for Phase 2. If that is not done, and then proceed to process it
Sure.
expeditiously. We can't set a deadline for approval because we can't hold them to our deadlines, but we can set a deadline for application. If that is missed, then it can be extended by the director for good cause for up to 3 more months. After that, they would have to come to this commission for a further extension. And if it's just missed and silence is all we hear, then staff can bring it forward to this commission at a noticed public hearing to consider revocation. And the revocation would just be of the portion of the CUP that permits the food blending use. The other uses that are proposed as part of Phase 1 are not unpermitted or are not listed in the land use table for the C1 zone. The use that is at issue is the ancillary food processing use. That's what would be subject to potential revocation if those deadlines are not met.
So of the Phase 1 activities or installations or whatever we might call them, the only one that requires the CUP is the dry powdered food product processing? You said, I heard you say the rest were permitted uses already.
Yes, because the other items are not land uses so much as they're structural items. The land uses, the bike rentals, and the no-fee community exercise class fit within the tourist serving uses of the C1 zone. It's that first use, the powdered food assembly and storage, that is this other
And all
use.
we're really looking at tonight, then, is whether we want to approve the installation of the room for the assembly and storage of the dry.
You're also looking at the rest of Phase 1, because tonight before you is both the CUP and the DRP, the conditional use
Oh, I
permit
see,
and the
okay,
design
so
review
the
permit.
others are covered by the DRP.
Correct.
Very good, thank you. Any other questions of staff?
And-
Go ahead, Bobby.
Well,
Sorry, not to interrupt.
so my question is, if the basic premise of your company is to make these food products, I still say that the processing of the powder is your primary function and everything else is kind of window dressing.
Okay, I think that's a fair question to
And-
address the applicant with.
And my concern is that it's kind of a manufacturing use, which is not permitted in this zone. And we had an example of a situation with Topa Brewing Company where they came and said, well, we shouldn't have to pay a parking fee, because there's other people here who didn't pay a parking fee, and it wouldn't be fair to us. So once we allow somebody to do a manufacturing right on the entrance of town on the main street, that is basically an inbound function and not the kind of function that maybe gives an insight as to what the town might be or offer, then what happens the next time somebody comes in and wants to do a manufacturing process and they say, well, you let them do it, so it's not fair that you don't let me do it. You know, I'll have 12 other activities that I'll just put out here. And I just wonder where the core, the heart of this is.
Okay, we are at that point in the meeting where we're asking questions of staff. And if staff can answer that, fine. If it's more appropriate for the applicant to answer,
Yes, so what happens the next time somebody wants to do manufacturing and said you have it down the street, so it's not fair if you don't allow me to do it? I think that's a staff question.
Yeah, so I mean, you're raising some of the same questions that we asked with when we were looking at this project. I would say, I think the idea, trying not to speak for the applicant, but one of the points that they made with all of these phases is that they're going to be more than just a food manufacturer, or food processor, and that it's more of a a lifestyle brand / tourist serving facility. But I do think that's probably a question that they would better answer.
Mr. Summers?
Just to add a brief further point, I'll let the applicant speak to the nature of their business. But with respect to the next application, each application is decided on its own merits. As much as we might like to think that it should be part of the consideration, pure fairness isn't within the code. Pure fairness isn't a land use consideration. What is a land use consideration is how have we interpreted the code in the past, this commission, the council, and how has the city applied the code? At present, I think it would be defensible if this was approved as an ancillary use and someone comes down the line who proposes, let's say, as an example, a
Meat packing plant.
or even a vegetable food manufacturing, where they take vegetables, add heat, add water, add other things, and then compress, combine, chemically change them. I think that would be something that we could defensively take the position and win in court, that is manufacturing is distinct from this. Because as I understand the use, as it has been revealed in the application materials, and I would expect to be confirmed by the applicant, they aren't adding heat, they aren't applying, they aren't chemically changing the food, they aren't cooking it or heating it or otherwise doing things to it that change its character in a more manufacturing way. And admittedly, that's a fairly narrow line. And the question for the commission is that line too narrow? But I think it would be defensible to both approve this and deny anything related to meat or deny the vegetable bar manufacturing facility.
Well, I basically manufacture in my business, then, according to what you're saying. I have a bakery, and we change the component into something else. We take fruit, vegetables, and we cook it, but that's what every restaurant does.
Well, restaurants are a separate category under the code.
So for me, the manufacturing component is less the adding heat or the changing of the component, but more that it is it's not a street-friendly process. And I think that that's why they've added all this other stuff to it, because they do want to manufacture there, or whatever you want to call it. And so, again, my concern is that then anybody wants to manufacture will just add, some street activity and say it's an ancillary project. And I don't necessarily, my concern is the integrity of the business as a whole. And okay, so maybe the bikes, the farmer's market, the whatever else, maybe that doesn't work. Well, let's try something else. And it's not a strong, well-defined concept. It's just things added on. And you can call it a lifestyle, and I mean, we call anything a lifestyle, but it takes a little bit more than that to be passionate, knowledgeable, and actually successful at doing these other projects that you add on to your business. And I want to make sure that we are trying to support businesses who are being honest about who they are, what they do, are good at it, and excel at it, so that our town is different from places that just have like all sorts of things going on. Our town's not big enough to just say, well, we can have anything. I think we really have to look at what it is that we do put in the town, and that's my concern.
I think good questions for the applicant on the strength of their business plan.
Good questions for the applicant. Chester? Nothing. Okay. I do have a couple of questions for staff. And James and I spoke to some of this stuff earlier. I did ask, excuse me, and I think that Ms. Nolan is going to be able to address the e-bicycle thing. We had a conversation this afternoon during the Complete Streets meeting where she said that there's Ventura County Code and California Code that addresses that topic, so I'll leave it. On page 5 of 6 of the staff report, and maybe this is something Ms. Nolan can also address, it says the landscaping to be submitted with future entitlement request as conditioned. That future entitlement request is the DRP for Phase 2 activities, or DRP and CUP for Phase 2? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, I was just looking at phase 2. I believe it was listed on there, but give me 1 second. Yes, under phase 2, new landscaping is included in that, would be included in that phase.
Okay, and but that is the future entitlement request as described in the table on page 5.
Yes.
Okay. I have a couple of additional questions when we get to looking at the resolution itself. But beyond that, I think we have our questions for staff, and I'd like to hear now from the applicant. I guess that means we're opening the public hearing?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. Chair Quillisi, commissioners and staff, Kathleen Nolan, landscape architect, and I'm representing the applicant. And I wanted to start off by saying that from the get-go, and I know this was presented to the Planning Commission as a concept in the past, the concept of having a sustainable business that actually provided more than one thing has been part of the vision of the applicants from the beginning. And so their product is a superfood product, and it's about healthy people and healthy lifestyles. And part of their initial thing was to make it also a community place. It happens to be 1.75 acres right there at the beginning of town. Of course, you know, it had been the old Ford dealership. And so as far as those the uses that you were bringing up, Commissioner Corbin, those were actually part of the initial concept, not something that was just added on recently. Yeah, so, and I think it was in your packet, but I just wanted to make everyone aware of that it was in the initial one. So basically, it's like a sustainable community place where things can actually happen, but actually it would be the headquarters for their business, which happens to be the retail and internet sales of their product. And so just up until recently, they have had the mixing of the product, which is a dry mix of ingredients, at another location down in Oxnard. And I know in the original concept, they said they would like to bring it all together into the one location. And because the Ford dealership had those large bays, which you could call a warehouse, but initially there were bays where they were doing mechanical work. They're not going to be building anything new for the so-called blending room. If you look in your packet, in the landscape plans, there's actually a plan from the manufacturer. So basically, it's a unit it's pre-built and it gets rolled into one of the existing bays. So there's not going to be any walls or anything built. You roll it in and the mixing or blending takes place in that room. They will be doing some cleaning and some sinks will be added, but that's really the only building permit that's going to be required, and it's all inside the existing bays, or if you want to call it a warehouse. So no additional buildings are going to be added to the property. And then as far as the other items, there was a window to be added, so there would be more airflow in one of the employee offices, the e-bike rentals, and as far as the landscape goes, all they have done there up to this point in time is they've added some planters around some of the existing light poles, and part of that was because people were running into the poles. So, and they've got geraniums in them. It's less than 500 square feet, so we didn't have to do a landscape plan as required by the MWELO. And those happen to be predominantly watered by wastewater from their air conditioning unit. So, as far as being sustainable, I would say they are. I think generally that's probably what I want to say, unless you've got any questions. And then I can also turn it over to Lynn and Reno Rollet, the applicants, and if you had any other further questions.
We did, I'm sorry, any questions for the applicant?
I just would like a description of what is actually going to go on in that processing component.
Yeah, I'll let him come up. Anything else for me at the moment?
No, one of our commissioners is absent tonight, but did send a note in expressing concern over the current drought conditions and asking how much marginal additional water would be used by this facility. That, it seems to me, is a fair question, and so that's one that
Good.
that we'd like to have answered.
I'll just generally answer it, and then I'll let Mr. Rollet answer that. But basically, this blending process doesn't require any water. It's basically dry powders. Dry powders are being mixed and then packaged. And that's what the processing is involved. Of course, there is a sink for, occasional cleanup. So I'll turn it over to them. I do not know how many gallons that will be. But as far as the processing goes, there are no liquids involved.
Okay, and as the background is presented by staff here, the business has been in operation in this facility since last year sometime, I take it. What has been going on there now?
So they have predominantly, their main business is retail and internet sales of their product.
Okay, which is currently produced elsewhere?
Yeah, packaged.
Packaged
or
elsewhere.
Blended elsewhere.
Brought in prepackaged lots, I presume, into this facility and then sold, or maybe even shipped from the other facility.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
The shipping actually does take place at the present location.
Okay.
But I'll hand it over to Mr. Rollet, and I'll be here
Thank
if you have
you.
any further questions.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Reno Rollet from Boku. Most of you may have already heard of me or know me, but so our company's been in town we've been in town 15 years. Our business started here in town 12 years ago. But to address, Bobby, your question about the process, so I actually love talking about this. We are a certified organic, kosher, and vegan company, so we deal with plant-based superfoods. We take enormous pride in sourcing the finest, most pure ingredients. They're simply harvested fresh, dried, and powdered. And this happens all over the world. We don't do that. When they come to us, they're in big bags, like bags of flour, big bags. And those ingredients are then blended according to our on-staff naturopathic medical doctor who formulates, he creates the recipes. So these ingredients go in a big blender. started out as a little hand blender, but now we have a power blender. And they're just blended together and then packaged in pouches. It's really that simple. Water is our enemy. If water comes in contact, the food begins to reanimate and it will start to break down. So we have to keep everything very dry. At the facility, we have been, since the year that's passed when we first moved into the building, operating administratively. And that's what we did when we first occupied the building, because we had our facility in Ventura and we weren't yet able, because it was a question as to whether we could blend and package in the facility. It's always been our position and the advice of counsel that we don't manufacture anything, but we're not arguing that point, right? It's an accessory use. I'm not sure how you want to interpret what's primary, what's secondary. Our business is blending and packaging superfoods. We sell to customers, frankly, now in 65 countries, most of them here, primarily in California. But so that's the first point about the process. Do you have any questions? No. Okay, so it's on your second item about, well, you made a few points about integrity and honesty and passion, and that actually got me a little excited because those are all things that are incredibly important to me, incredibly important to our family. We love Ojai, much the way I'm sure you do and all of us do. We're very, very proud, incredibly honored, almost overwhelmingly so, to be in that spot. It's a spot I dreamt about, living here in town for as long as I have and driving by and seeing it neglected and blighted, and just dreamt and wondered what might happen there. And I never, frankly, in the beginning imagined we could be there, but we have worked very hard and the business has grown. We started the company in our home. We moved into Ventura, where we operated for about 10 years. And then when the opportunity came, we grew to the point we needed to move. I submitted an offer to the people that own the property, and it took about 2 years, and we finally were able to make the deal. So what I really wanted to do was to honor the potential, not just for us as a company, but for the community. So that's the reason we do community-based exercise programs. That's the reason we have our e-bike business that we were going to do with your son-in-law, and that we were in those talks for quite a while, because we love the bike trail. We love the idea of giving people an option. So instead of driving through town and adding to the congestion, they could possibly get on a bicycle and enjoy our town on a bicycle. And also the market, art market. We'd love to create a venue for artists. Farmers market talks. We're in conversation with a lot of leaders and thought leaders, and we'd like to offer the venue to them. Once again, the idea of creating community benefits. So these things that I really appreciate your concern. I think it's absolutely valid concern, and I think we're absolutely in alignment because, again, those things, integrity, passion, honesty, and being good. I think you also mentioned being good at what we do. We're the best at what we do. We're a family business. We're incredibly committed, dedicated to being the best. That's why we don't take shortcuts. That's why we offer only products that are certified organic and kosher. That's why all of our products contain no gluten, no whey, no soy, no dairy. These things, frankly, if our ingredients were to make it into a storm drain, and I'm not kidding, the planet would rejoice. Like, the fish would love it, the plants would love it. There are no pesticides, there are no herbicides, there are no chemicals of any kind in what we do. And contrary, with all due respect to your point about being there at the front of town and making a statement, and I'll speak for my family, am enormously proud of the fact that I think we make a great statement for Ojai. I understand this community, I love this community, and I think superfood and super living and what we do as a company and our core values, which are to positively impact people, make a profound statement. And I defend that, and I'll continue to defend that, because our business, my family, and this community means everything to us. So that's pretty much our story, and I understand that you weren't here for the initial presentation when we shared most of this. We're at a point where, I know James mentioned it wasn't urgent, but it was important. It really is urgent to us. As a family business, we had to shut down our facility in Ventura, and we were in the process of moving the facility into Ojai, and we were of the understanding that everything was fine, based on the advice that we had received from the person who was representing us prior. And we didn't know there were any issues until the plumbing permit was denied. And I was actually quite shocked with that. So we have done everything we could to try to expedite the process because we are now in a limbo state where we have co-packers, but it's incredibly cost prohibitive. It takes jobs away from the community. We employ people here in town. We really do need to get that facility up and running. And fortunately, thanks to some help from city managers and other staff, we were able to get the permit. So this last month we've been waiting has not been wasted. We were able to cut our drains and install our sinks, and now it's just a matter of bringing this prefabricated modular room into the warehouse so that we can conduct operations.
When you say pre-manufactured modular room, is that exactly what it is? Is that where the preparation takes place?
Yeah, so in the...
So it's like a cubicle?
Yeah, well, it's 4 walls and a ceiling, and yeah, that's essentially it. It has to be...
Is it assembled inside? Is it
we will
trucked
assemble
in?
it.
Is
We
it on
assemble it outside and roll it in or slide it in, but we'll assemble it in. Actually, to be honest, I'm speaking with consultants now about how exactly we're going to do it. We're at that point now where we have to build. It's like, to me, it's like
for a reason because it's a clean room? Is that what it is?
it's essentially a clean room, but they call it more a green room because it's not an ISO pharmaceutical green room. It's just a room, but it does have to conform
Right.
with USDA and FDA standards. I mean, we have to meet a very, very high standard to maintain our organic certification. So we have to meet USDA and FDA compliance. And so this is a room that does that. But it is essentially, it's like a big
How many
Lincoln
how
log.
many of
It's like a
those are
big-
going in there?
Sorry?
How many of those are there?
There's just one. There's one room, and then we have a cooler that's a 10 by
Right.
12
Got it.
refrigerated cooler.
So all that packaging happens in that one room?
All of it, right? And it has to, yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And then the other bit where we have the sinks, that's just purely for wash down, pails and things of that nature. And by the way, I just want to add, on the subject of water, I honestly believe you would be so hard pressed to find anyone that cares more about water than we do. We're, I believe, very committed stewards of the planet, of the environment, and especially water is so near and dear to my wife and I. And so, once again, water is the enemy of our product, but beyond that, we're doing things to capture water, so that we can use it for irrigation, doing things very, very smart and sensible. So I think you'd all be very proud of that aspect of our business and approach as well.
Okay. Any more questions for Mr. Rowley?
I just want to say I like what you've done with the building.
Thank you. Thank you.
I watched that whole process. I was really impressed with what you ended up with.
Thank you. It's been a great process for us as a family, too, to see it come along. Thank you for,
Yeah, kudos to the painter to make it
Peter
look
Stewart.
like the wood.
thank you.
A very interesting exterior there. I'd never seen anything like it, and I like it.
Thank you very much.
Um,
Thank you.
Any other questions for Ms. Nolan? Okay. Anyone else in the audience wish to speak on this topic? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious about.
Please come to the lectern if you intend to speak. Give us your name and address.
Okay, I'm Kim Tukdarian, and I live in Ojai outside the city limits. My question, I've got a certificate of achievement in both water and wastewater, specializing in the water industry. And even just washing down nutrients poses a problem as far as algae growth and biological oxygen demand. So it's actually very important that the ECI, environmental compliance inspectors, are aware of this so they can give a rating, as well as the wastewater industry. You cannot just go dumping stuff in storm drains and call it good without causing potential algal blooms, which then cause fish die-off and everything else because the algae takes over. I have done all 22 classes, 69 units in water science at the college, and 101 continued education units through Cal State Sacramento. So I am aware of it. You cannot just say, oh, they shut us down in Ventura, we'd like to come Ojai, everything will be okay. If it washes out to the ocean, it washes into the thing or goes to the wastewater plant, they won't mind. So it is important that they be aware too of this and any kind of environmental compliance be met. But it can be. They can have tanks, they can have treatment areas, they can have stuff that it's perfectly doable, but it has to be handled by a professional who's aware of what they're dealing with. So they've done a wonderful job. They've put a lot of work into it. And going international, I mean, bring in some money for the U.S., but make sure you're not going to harm the area you live. And I know they don't intend to. They probably aren't aware of this. It's just that I've studied it and spent a lot of time.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I respond?
Of course.
Thank you.
As the applicant, you have an almost open end on speaking to the commission.
Well, I thank you for sharing your expertise and your passion for water and the potential contamination. First of all, I just want to say our ingredients are incredibly expensive. We only source the finest, and so these are rare earth ingredients. Trust me, it pains me to see 1 granular of lucuma or spirulina or chlorella or sacha inchi get wasted. So it's not as though we're washing anything down the drain. We do have a clarifying system, by the way. I'm not sure if you're aware. We have a full-blown clarifying system, which I knew nothing about. I had no idea what that is, but basically it's 3 chambers in the ground. So when the water drains, it goes into one, all the sediment collects at the bottom, and then that tank fills, and then the water flows to the next. And then that sediment, whatever there might be, settles to the bottom, the water rises to the top and flows to a 3rd chamber. That fills before anything makes its way into the storm drain. And at that point, I would like to think it's incredibly minimal, but even more at work, sort of mitigating the loss of these ingredients or any environmental impact, is the fact that we're incredibly thorough in our process, because these are really, really expensive ingredients.
Well, we have to vacuum first.
Yeah, that all has to, yeah.
Vacuum system.
And then that food, when we vacuum and clean, we share with animals. We have a program where we share with
Talk to
animals.
the
'Cause
commission.
we share any waste with animals. Horses, dogs, cats love these foods, and we have amazing testimonials from people who have benefited from that. But on another point that you made, and I'm not sure if it was intentional, but you mentioned us getting kicked out of Ventura, or I'm not sure how you phrased it, but we weren't kicked out of Ventura. We voluntarily left our facility in Ventura to move to Ojai. So I'm pretty sure Ventura loved us. We loved being down there as well, but much happier being here. So I just wanted to address your concerns.
Go ahead, Chester.
Speaking of that, is there a regulatory agency that monitors your food processing?
Absolutely, yeah, because we're USDA certified organic, so we have to deal with USDA and FDA, the Food and Drug Administration compliance, which are extremely rigorous, but even more rigorous than that is our rabbi flamer, because we're certified kosher. So really the key difference, the standards are essentially the same, but when the USDA or the FDA come to do an audit, we have some heads up. And it's not just the processing in the facility, it's also tremendously in-depth and detailed paperwork. But the kosher inspections happen randomly, so we just never know when good old Rabbi Flamer is going to show up. So we do answer to a very, very, very high standard in terms of regulatory compliance.
And we have to follow an SOP, standard operation.
Please come forward.
This is Lynn.
So we have to follow a standard operating procedure guideline, and the book is probably this thick. And, it's step by step, everything has to be documented along the way. And, waste, like I actually have to measure if it falls on the floor. It's usually about a dustpan, but we have to account for everything, what went in and what came out. And even anything that's a waste, I have to account for it on my SOPs, so.
Right, how often are the inspections made?
Well, I put in, usually it's a year. You could expect the FDA, you just never know. They could just randomly come. But usually, every year, the rabbi, it's usually, it could be once a month, it could be every other month. You just never know, but I always run my business ready for whoever walks in, so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Anyone else wish to speak on the topic? Okay, we'll close the public hearing and bring the discussion back to the commission. Yes, that's right. Mr. Merck, your
Sir.
comments.
Actually, I don't have any comments. I'm excited about this project, and I'm ready to vote on a motion, so.
Okay. Ms. Corbin? Okay, I like the idea. I think the fact that the business has been here in town operating for a year or thereabouts without this dry powder processing aspect to it convinces me that the main part of this business is sales of the product, not the mixing of powders to create the product. And so I would consider this processing to be an ancillary function. Other than that, I think that it's a good business to have in Ojai. I applaud your passion, and I'm ready to vote as well. Chester?
I'll make a motion.
All right.
I'll make a motion to approve the condition CUP 18-02 and design review permit DRP 17-12 for the expansion of an existing use to Boku International, a health food company that processes and packages food products.
I'll second that.
Okay. Any discussion?
I believe we're also approving the findings, conditions of approval and the CEQA findings.
Yes.
Thank you.
Assuming the conditions of approval and the CEQA finding. I did have one question for staff before we vote. The CUP, as I understand it, exists with the product, with the parcel, not with the applicant per se. That is to say, if someone bought this company, they would still be able to use the activities that are allowed under the CUP. Is that correct?
Yeah, the CUP runs with the land, so it's not so much buying the company, it's buying the land.
Right, okay. How about the DRP? Is that the same way? Does that go with the land?
Yeah, the DRP goes with the structure because it approves the modifications to the structure, so that if the land is sold, then the applicant can continue to take advantage of, or the buyer could continue to operate as approved. Changes, of course, would require new permits.
But anything that's approved under the current CUP and DRP would still be usable by a new party that had that business?
Right, that bought the land.
Okay. Very good. Any other discussion? Yes, Bob?
Well, the only thing I would like to say is that I would feel better about this if it were kind of like the Guinness plant in Ireland, where they manufacture there, but it is so open and informative and user-friendly. There's a museum about all the equipment. You go in, and I think that if that were the focus and you really developed that end of your business rather than trying to have any other, a farmer's market, which we already have one, and God knows, I understand the juice bar, that makes sense to me. I just would like it to be more about what you actually do. Sure.
The public hearing's closed.
Yeah,
Be
the
up to the chair.
public hearing's closed. It's okay.
I just feel that that would make the manufacturing part of it more appropriate for that particular type of site.
Okay?
Should we take a vote?
And I'd like to call the question. Can we have a roll call, please?
Merck,
Yes.
Corbin,
No.
Quillisi,
Yes.
Jagiello.
Yes.
Motion
Okay.
passes.
3-1. Congratulations, you have your CUP and your DRP.
Bobby, I'll stop in if you're open to it and address, it's a great point you made.
But we
are
have
planning.
kids. We wanna
Visibility, field trips, education, all that's very meaningful. Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Our next public hearing item, oops, missed it there, is movable tiny homes text amendment, TA 18-02. Can we hear from staff, please?
Yes, thank you. Give me 1 second.
Well, should we wait till the Commissioner, Vice Chair Nolan returns?
I'm
Good
sorry,
point.
yes. Thank you. That was rude and insensitive.
You just didn't know. It wasn't conscious.
Did you say something?
I
Becky?
didn't,
He
no.
forgot you
I
weren't
didn't
here.
wait for you to rejoin the commission
Oh,
before announcing the next agenda item. My apologies. Staff?
Okay. This is the continuation of the tiny home discussion that occurred most recently on July 18th. Just I'll keep it brief. As a reminder, the ordinance was directed to return to the Planning Commission from the City Council with a request to make a recommendation whether to adopt the ordinance and or to identify any needed changes to the ordinance. The Planning Commission would need to take action tonight to enable the item to return to council at the next meeting, which is the August 28th meeting. This ordinance treats movable tiny homes as a additional type of accessory dwelling unit, but essentially a smaller, movable, and pre-built accessory dwelling unit, which would be capped at 440 square feet rather than the typical 1,200 square feet. The community development director would review the design of the tiny home, but not for ANSI standards. Or they would review, they wouldn't inspect for ANSI standards. And following the last meeting where this ordinance was discussed, we have made the following changes as discussed, which include clarifying that the property owner must sign or give written permission to the tiny home owner, removing, as part of the application process, removing the phrase self-contained from the definition of tiny home, revising the utility section to match the utility section of other ADUs rather than having its own utility standard. This would allow separate utility meters and a separate system if applicable. We changed the duration of the time from 1 to 3 years, meaning that each property owner can allow one tiny home on their property, assuming they meet all the requirements, every 3 years, and not able to switch tiny homes out more frequently than that. We also clarified that solar panels could be on the roof of the tiny homes, and clarified that the tiny homes would be allowed to obtain street addresses. The Planning Commission could choose to recommend the adoption of the ordinance. They could recommend that council not adopt the ordinance, or that council adopt a modified ordinance from this version. And that's all.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for staff? Chester?
We also talked about changing the minimum square footage to 150 versus 100. And the reason being is 100 is a 10 by 10. There's certainly, that's about as small of a bedroom as you can imagine, and then you'd have to fit a bathroom in there and a little kitchen. So that's my input.
Or 8 by 12 and a half, because it's got to fit on a road.
Yeah, well, right, the length of it, but I'm just giving
Yeah.
broad square footage.
Right, right.
So I will change that if we make if we make a motion, I'll just change that within the motion.
Okay. Kathy, any questions for staff? Bobby, John? Okay. I had a couple. I appreciate, Mr. Vega, you clarifying the property owner giving written permission. The staff report, page 3, says written permission to the property owner, and you clarified that as the tiny homeowner. I do have a question about the description of the duration of prohibition against excessive movement that's on page 4 of 6 of the staff report. And I guess my real question is, this excessive movement compliance that is inherent in this paragraph and elsewhere in the resolution itself, how is that enforced? Are we depending on neighborhood complaints because there's a large number or a frequent number of movable tiny homes going in and out of a single lot? Or is there going to be done by the city some sort of periodic visual inspection? And if so, what would be the basis for that? Because these are movable tiny homes, as is clarified in many places here, these structures are regulated by the DMV, by the Department of Motor Vehicles at the state level, and I presume as a result they all carry license plates. Now, license plates are easily swapped, I'll agree, but how do you anticipate the city will enforce this requirement for no excessive movement of a tiny home?
I think at this point, I would assume that most of the enforcement is going to be in response to complaints. If a neighbor calls and says, hey, another tiny home was on this property last week and now there's a new tiny home, we'd be able to pull the application identifying the tiny home that has permission to be there, visit the site and see if it's the same tiny home. At this time, there's no plan to have, a screening program where we would go out once a month or whatever it ends up being and randomly inspect. But that could change, and that's, we've had discussions with council as a whole on the code enforcement situation within the city and how that's treated. And that could be part of that discussion, but at this point, I would expect that it's complaint-based enforcement.
Okay, I was curious because in light of the fact that Fresno has had a movable tiny homes, or whatever they call them there, ordinance for some period of time now, and not only have had no permits issued for same, they have not had any permits requested for same. So I'm not sure, because Fresno's a much bigger place than Ojai, I'm not sure it would be a big drain on city resources if we had one tiny home or two tiny homes. But I would certainly want to understand better what the enforcement protocol is here. If it's just complaints, that's an answer, not, to me, not a satisfying answer, but it's
If
an
I
answer.
could add another point on that.
Yes, sir.
So two more points. One is the other, in addition to complaints, if an applicant came in and applied, imagine a potential likely scenario. You get a movable tiny home is moved onto a property, permitted, compliant, and then the owner migrates elsewhere, brings their tiny home with them. Now the land is vacant again, and then the owner, a new tiny home comes in and applies again, thinking, oh, it's fine, one tiny house, another tiny house, still only one. When they come in and apply, then the city would proactively say, no, you were permitted a year ago, year and a half ago, 2.5 years ago for a tiny house, you're blocked until the end of this period, and would identify that period. So that would also be an opportunity to catch it before it's already on the property. And that would apply even if, for example, a landowner owns a property, a tiny house is permitted, and then they sell the property, then the tiny house leaves. The new owner, thinking, may not even realize that it'll be an obligation on owners to apprise their buyers, but the new owner who bought it would still be subject to the prohibition. The prohibition runs with the land, not the owner. And
If the new owner knew
it
that
wouldn't
there
even
was
matter.
a requirement to request permission,
Well, it wouldn't.
if another movable tiny home were just pulled onto the property, absent any neighborhood complaints that the tiny home that's there doesn't look like the one that was there last month. Or maybe it does. Maybe it's the same model from the same
If
manufacturer.
it was the same model,
Yeah.
we would, at that point, would be relying, if they don't come in for the permit up front, we're going to be relying on neighborhood
Your
complaints.
statement posits another application.
Right, and if there's not another application, then indeed, we are relying on neighborhood complaints. Whether to take a more proactive enforcement approach is a fundamental policy choice for the city council, because that speaks to how to allocate the city's budget, and
Okay.
it speaks to how the city intends to operate a code enforcement program. Those are valid questions, certainly, but they are questions for the city council.
Okay, Bobby?
Well, I don't really think that, I'm not crazy about this 3-year requirement. I think that it, in many ways, punishes the property owner who actually pays property tax in the event that he allows somebody to move onto their property and something happens and they move and then he's punished. And the person who moved, for whatever reason, can just go put it somewhere else. I don't think these things are that easy to move in and move out. I feel that it's much better if we require that they put what we talked about, some decking or porch, a couple sides, to make it even harder to move it out. I think that putting this restriction on it is going to prohibit many property owners not that there'll be that many who can actually put one on their property, but, you know, it would make me pause to think about allowing somebody that I knew to put one on there. I'd probably say, well, I'll buy it, but then that's a different scenario. I would like to get rid of that. I think a year is plenty.
Chester?
As a builder in Ojai, I can attest that it's very rare that we can do anything here without a phone call, right, Sherry, to the office in a complaint. Okay, so the idea that you're going to move this gigantic tiny home, which is a big deal.
Is that a new category, gigantic
They're
tiny
big.
homes?
They're big, and they're hard to move in the backyards of people's homes. This is not something that's going to secretly be done without anybody noticing. Okay, and I can tell you that I can't do anything in this town as a builder without somebody calling in. And Sherry can contest to that. So I am very confident that our system will work
Okay,
from experience.
Could I add one thing too? So I just want to clarify. So would we say, I believe a comment was made about the property owner would be punished, and I just want to make clear. So the only limitation on the property owner is they can't let more than one tiny home come onto their property every 3 years. It doesn't mean that they would be required to let that tiny home stay for 3 years. They could have a 1 year, lease with the tiny home and then decide that they don't want to extend it. And they have 2 years till they can have a new tiny home, but they can ask that tiny home to leave. So I don't necessarily think there's a punishment for the tiny home or for the property owner. There's just a limitation on how often he can move different tiny homes into his property.
Kathy?
Just a comment. Part of our discussion earlier about extending it from the 1 year was that the issue came up, members of the public had come in, and in our commission discussion, that we were trying to discourage transient housing. We're trying to create more permanent housing, although we know this is a new type of housing, but it would fall under the ADU ordinance. And so that's where the extension of more than a year. And I think it makes sense. And the other part of that discussion was, if you're going to the expense of actually moving it in, and it's not going to just drop in overnight, there's some,
Well, hooking up utilities.
Oh, yeah, hooking up all the
You've got to
utilities.
skirt the thing. You probably have to put a deck in front of it.
Right, you probably have
It's
to put either a
substantial amount
slab
of-
or
yeah.
gravel compacted. I mean, there's preparation work. So I think that being said, that a property owner would most likely want the tiny house to be there longer. They can charge the rent for a longer period of time. It's more lucrative for them to do that. But part of it was to eliminate the more transient movement.
I just think that it will discourage the property owner from allowing somebody else to put theirs on their property, and they would rather purchase their own and put it on there. And from the discussion, it seemed that there were people who were in favor of being able to purchase their own and put it on there so that it would be their house. And if we're going to go into this whole thing of tiny houses, which, again, I agree with you that there are very few properties in the city itself where you can actually get it onto the property in the way that it needs to be done. I don't think there's going to be a lot of them. But if we're going to embrace this type of housing, I would say let's embrace it. And let's do it in a way that allows for more configurations, that allows for people to buy one and put it on somebody's property that they know, rather than them saying, oh, well, and then, you have to stay for 3 years. And you never know what life's going to bring. I mean,
Well,
maybe they'll leave,
yeah,
maybe they'll
okay.
sell it. I also would really like the possibility of taking a look at this sustainability idea and maybe allowing a handful of composting toilets to see in fact how they work, if they're monitored, as because.
Can we save some of this for the
Yeah.
deliberations of the
Yeah,
commission?
sure.
We're in the stage right now where we're
We have
asking
staff.
questions of staff.
Okay, so anyway, that's my concern with the 3 years on it.
Okay. Anyone else?
I have one more question
go
for
ahead.
staff. We also mentioned the idea of mandating the idea of putting on a deck on the outside. How do you foresee, or can you foresee how that would be incorporated in the ordinance?
We can add it if the commission wishes. It's
Right, but
not
a-
presently
it's
there. It
just
can
a
be added if
simple-
you wish.
It's a simple request, yeah, it's
Yeah,
just
I
so we
mean-
could just make a simple request and take a minimum size, yeah.
And then I think in terms of structuring it, consider whether you want it to be minimum decking on one side, two sides,
Right,
three
right.
sides,
Right.
or do you want to set it and/or minimum square footage, minimum, I don't know, 100, 200?
Well, see, to
whatever
me,
number's
those
appropriate.
types of things tend to, first of all, most people that I know who have tiny homes have decks, because the houses are tiny and the decks are, and in California too, we have great outdoor space. So they love to do it, and I think it also adds to the stability of them, and right? And so, the more you do to anchor that home in there to make it look like a traditional home, the less they're going to move it. So anyway, we'll talk about that during the discussion then.
Okay, I do have another question in terms of protocols, I guess. In the resolution itself, it doesn't say anything about the tiny home owner getting a letter from the property owner. Specifically, attachment B, page 4 of 7, paragraph, it's L, 3C. It says the applicant is the property owner, or if not, that the property owner has signed the application form consenting in writing to the intended location. Is that what is meant by the other sentence in the staff report?
That's the language that implements the point as described in the
Okay.
staff report.
Okay.
And
then-
this confirms that the city will have written request, thus baked into the application, and thus written permission from both the owner of the tiny house and the owner of the applicant. Or
Okay.
the owner of the property, that is.
Okay,
And most importantly, the property owner. We wouldn't want the situation where the tiny house owner just shows up without any word from the property owner.
of course.
That's not viable.
In addition to that, I know there are other places, and I won't cite them at the moment, in the proposed resolution that talks about establishing utility systems, separate or not so separate water and electrical and sewer as a minimum. And the requirement is that those utility systems all be provided in an underground fashion. But I don't see where all that has to take place before the movable tiny home shows up on the property. I believe that all of those things are the responsibility of the property owner, not the tiny home owner, if that's two separate parties.
Or the two of them can negotiate among themselves. The property owner could grant a lease to a tiny house owner that says, I lease you the space for the tiny house and enough room to do your utility work. To me, that's a deal that the two of them will strike. We can-
Provided that utilities, as prescribed by the Ojai Municipal Code, are in place prior to the arrival of the movable tiny home?
So prior to arrival is distinct from prior to permitting. It may be the case that it's possible someone would move it on in the dead of night, for example, and then come in and apply. I think we would take the position that you can't move it on the property until a permit has been issued. But if you wanted to structure it more directly, that can be done. So tiny house may not be placed on the property until the permit is issued by the city.
Yeah, but
Well,
that's
I
pretty,
got a
that.
permit,
yeah,
I got a
that's-
permit for remodeling my home, and my home wasn't completely remodeled. In fact, it wasn't started until after I got the permit.
But it's not signed off. Your permit's not signed off until everything's in place.
Okay.
You get the permit which says you can do it, but it doesn't
Right.
say that it's done.
I'm not seeing in here how we enforce that all of these utility systems are in place before the movable tiny home shows up on the property.
I don't think
Well,
they
that's in
have
the
to be-
inspection process. That's just
Yeah.
a standard inspection process, because then when they pull a permit, you know, you have to call for an inspection, and the assumption here is they're gonna say, okay, here's the checklist, and this is typical, you call in the inspection.
Where's your pad, where's your utilities?
Yeah, and it's
All that
it's gonna
stuff.
be, and they're gonna come out, and they're gonna look for
Right.
the post,
And
they're gonna
won't
check
sign
out
off
your.
on it.
Yeah, and then you're gonna, you pass your inspection or you don't, you know, and you get.
And that permit, that building permit, right,
It
is one
requires
that
some
will
inspections.
ultimately be issued to the property owner.
And the applicant.
Yeah.
If they're not, if the owner of the tiny house and the owner of the property are not the same, then it's issued to
Right.
both of them.
Yes.
If they are the same, it's issued.
Just
And
like I
then-
can pull a permit as a contractor
Right.
for a client as well.
Right, okay. Now, if the permit is issued to the property owner and the movable tiny house owner, and after 1 year, 3 years, whatever, the movable tiny house owner departs the property, what is the status of that? Is it, because the building permit was signed off sometime in the past, everything remains legal and someone else could come in with another movable tiny home? I don't understand
That's
the
the
process
point.
right now.
Okay, so let me see if I can clarify that point. Once issued and finalized, which means the permit is issued, now you may move the tiny home on, and you may prepare and fix up your utilities and the decking, for example. The decking is something that couldn't be installed. From what I understand about tiny houses, you'd put it down, then put the decking next to it. That couldn't necessarily be done before.
And is that a separate building permit from the one for the utilities, for example?
It may not be
It-
required.
It might not be required, we don't have.
Depending on the height of the decking, it may not require a building permit.
Anything
That
less
height.
than 18 inches is not required to get a permit.
And that's 18 inches from clearance between the
Grade.
ground and the deck. That's-
Okay,
So assuming it's less than 18 inches, it wouldn't need a building permit, it would need the tiny house permit. So the tiny house permit would be issued together with the utility permits, allowing the person to do the work, move the tiny house on site, move the deck in place, connect the utilities. Then they have to come in and final it. And our step, the enforcement step is the utilities aren't turned on until the utility permit is final. So they wouldn't be able, you know, our bad actor, dead of night person wouldn't be able to live in the tiny house without finishing the utility permit, proving to us compliance with, among other things, all of the standards in this ordinance, plus the standards of the utility provider applicable to each utility. Then the permit would be finalized, signed off, utilities turned on, then they could live in it. And now let's fast forward 2.5 years, this person moves their tiny house, they move on. Now we have permitted utility connections that are capped off, and a tiny house is not there. The new property owner would not be able to, now, depending on, let's say,
or same property owner, new tiny home.
same property owner, new tiny home, he would, whether it's 3 years or 1 year, if it's 1 year, then this is a 6-month process. If the period hadn't run, our minimum excessive movement period had not run, then the new property owner could not install a new tiny house for that period. Once the period is run, so say the commission and the council set the period at 1 year, and now we're 2 years out. Okay, so that's not a problem. And then the property owner would have to apply for a new tiny house permit. It might be easier because he already has utilities, but it would still require a new permit for that new
There are
tiny
definitely two permits. There's one for, if you want,
house. The utilities are a separate
the
permit, yes.
infrastructure, the utilities, the pad where the tiny home
And
resides
depending
or
on
whatever.
the grading involved for the pad, that may or may not require a grading permit.
No, it won't. It shouldn't. We should
It
not
would-
obligate it to, because we're talking about a grade on
It's not
grade.
separately
Yeah.
obligated. It would depend on the amount of grading involved. If I had a hill and I wanted to flatten the hill,
Okay,
that would
got
take
it,
a permit.
okay, sure.
We're not, our staff's recommendation is not to set a separate grading permit requirement,
okay.
but just to leave it stat. But assuming you had a flat pad, a flat existing pile of dirt, you just want to put some concrete, that wouldn't need a building
Does the
permit.
undergrounding of the utilities infrastructure generate the need for a PAW and perhaps a Phase 1 inspection of
Perhaps.
the property?
That's going to depend on the nature
Or
of
is
the
it
property.
Yes on the PAW and perhaps on anything beyond that?
Perhaps on the PAW and perhaps on the Phase 1. The reason perhaps on the PAW is that you'll recall the PAW requirement, and for those not steeped in our process, PAW stands for Preliminary Archaeological Assessment.
Right.
It's a quick look by an archaeologist in this city at the archaeological, prehistoric, and historic resources and cultural resources that may be present on a property. That initial analysis is done based on a council-approved resolution earlier this year that sets the PA requirement for most ground disturbing work with some exceptions, one of which is in a documented previously disturbed area of a parcel. So to use an example, if I had a backyard and a concrete patio with a barbecue and a little sink that had a gas line, electricity, and a water line to the barbecue on the back end of a pad, and I proposed to put a tiny house at the end of the pad, for example, and I had enough land to do this, that utility construction, adjusting those utility connections to connect to the tiny house may not require a PA because that's a existing disturbed utility
No
line.
new ground disturbance.
Or even if I cracked open the ground and had to expand the water line, for example, because I installed a narrow sewer line, I have to install a larger sewer line, for example. That may not require a PA because it's previously disturbed and documented previously disturbed. So that's why it's maybe on PA and maybe on phase one. It's going to depend on your site characteristics. Virgin land, undisturbed entire area entirely, definitely looking at a PA. But again, that's a bit fact specific.
Okay, but in this discussion where we've talked about a property building permit and in the case of two different owners, a tiny house or a movable tiny house permit, the one must be signed off before the other can be signed off, correct? The property improvements, the utilities, whatever, must be final signed off before the tiny home can be moved and get its own final inspection, whether it's with or without a required permit
It
for
would
a
have to
deck or whatever.
Simultaneously, yeah. I mean,
The tiny house permit could not be signed off until the utilities were complete. The tiny house could be put on the site first, and then you
Because in some
pull the
instances.
permit and
you
then
might
build it.
Do that.
yeah.
Just
Because,
can't occupy it until.
exactly, it couldn't be occupied, the utilities couldn't be turned on until those had all been covered.
And that's true with any ADU. It's the same process.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions for staff? All right, we'll open the public hearing, and we have 4 so far professed speakers. I'll take them in order of their appearance here at the dais, and number 1 is Wendy Hilgers.
I just have a few comments because I've spoken before. But one thing, I'm just so perplexed sitting there listening to you struggling with all the details of this project. It's so complicated. And I've heard you before say, oh, you love the ordinance because it's so simple. It's not simple at all. The Tiny Homes Association has traveled across the United States looking for places to put their homes because there is no legal definition for what they've built. Some are legal, some are not. Well, some have been built to some kind of standard, some have not. So the problems that they carry with them are huge. And they've been to hundreds of cities, talked to thousands of people. And the thing is, they have a place to go. There are 2 places, and that's where they found homes in every other state and city except Fresno, and maybe a few more, I don't know. And that would be where a recreational vehicle park or a special purpose park, a community of like kind of minded people and like vehicles, where they can share the cost, the improvements, the safety, the health, the issues that brought them into that lifestyle to begin with. It's a lifestyle that they've chosen, and it's wonderful for a lot of people. But I don't think it belongs in the residential neighborhoods in little communities like Ojai, for sure, 4.3 square miles. You're struggling with the details. These are people, they're wonderful people, I'm sure. I mean, I know some of them, but they don't care about following the law. They're already living outside the law. And that may not mean a lot to some people, but when you move into a situation where you're in a society like this, that we obey the laws, we believe in them, but it doesn't seem to matter as much. and that bothers me. I think one of the issues is they don't even realize, maybe some of them, how nice it would be to be in a small community. Maybe Ojai isn't the right place. Maybe Ojai doesn't even have the land for that kind of a thing. But to build communities where they can share and enjoy together, just like a campground that we used to do when we were kids, and you get a bunch of little tents together and, whatever your living structure is. But I think just listening to this situation that was brought to Ojai by people who don't live in Ojai, who want to live in Ojai, and represented to the Planning Commission and the City Council that they would like to have these considered as accessory dwelling units so they could be moved into backyards like the mandate that the state already has for accessory dwelling units. But the problems are insurmountable. And number one is, why would you even have to be talking about how long they should stay there if there isn't that concern that they're going to be leaving? And that's what people have talked to us about. They don't like the neighborhood to be transient. They want it to be permanent. That to me is just an oxymoron. It just doesn't make sense at all. So anyway, I'm still concerned about the issue of how could you possibly maintain any kind of a standard? How would it be policed? How would it be enforced? People are hesitant to report on the neighbor. Anyway, thank you. It's complicated.
Yes, it is.
Anyway,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Nick Hydesmith and Kim Hook-Dannon is up next.
Yeah, hi. My name's Nick Hydesmith. I live on Shady Lane. I'm against tiny house amendment. A tiny house without wheels is an ADU, and we already have a system in place to address having an ADU on your property. A tiny house with wheels is a way for someone to install a dwelling without conforming to building codes that are in place to protect lives and property. ANSI codes are for RVs, not permanent dwellings. Tiny house people want to live off the grid. This only means they are living without paying taxes and usage fees that the rest of the community is paying. I've heard the argument that there will not be many of them. How do we know this for sure? Can the Planning Commission guarantee us that in the future, half of Ojai will not have tiny houses in it, and the other half of the residents will not be paying for them to live here? I know that's kind of a far extreme, but 20 years from now, how do you know that that couldn't occur? This is not a solution for affordable housing. It will become a problem for our city in the future. Please stop this amendment tonight, or otherwise be remembered as the people responsible for one of the biggest mistakes. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. Kim?
I've been in Ojai since I was 6 months old, so I've seen a lot of changes throughout our town. One of my major concerns with this tiny house amendment, the tiny houses on wheels, is basically the freeloading factor. We leave the wheels on, we put the deck around, and we don't have to comply with the other things that everyone else is having to pay. Another concern would be, how do you evict them? Who's going to be responsible when that person is loud or filthy or doing things that cause problems? Is the property owner going to be responsible? Is there going to be a huge deal and an expense to try and get rid of that person? Gypsies in Romania cause problems in Romania, Czechoslovakia, other surrounding countries. That's because they're transient. They have a transient lifestyle. We're welcoming transiency. Another concern is basically the loft. If you look and read the codes, that loft is intended for storage only, not for human inhabitation, not for someone to crawl into a confined space and sleep with no emergency exit. You could have your solar batteries catch fire, your space heater, your incense, your candle. That fire can start below you and you've got no way out. And who is going to be responsible? The city of Ojai, because they said they were safe. That is who's going to be sued. And are they going to admit that they pushed for this? No. It will be the responsibility of the city. It will be the city's expense. It will be a big liability. Another problem is they call it an RV. It's not a reasonable RV. It should have a permit just like large items, permitted to be on the road to get them there, and then it becomes a home. They're not driving it around. They're not taking it to Lake Casitas for the weekend. They're living in it like it's a home. Pay what homes do. Pay your utility usage fee. Pay your school taxes. Pay your property taxes. Don't try and sneak in and avoid paying what everyone else is having to pay. And you know they're not going to take the wheels off if they can freeload. I wouldn't. Would you? Another concern is the roofing. These are movable homes, but you say, oh, why should we require them to have any more than we require in town? It's movable. What if they park that thing in a field under an oak tree? Guess what? You just moved something that the roofing's okay. You're saying it's fine. You're not putting it to the highest fire standard, and you stuck it under an oak tree because it's movable. So these rules, and are they going to have a way to identify them? Will there be a tag like there is on a vehicle? How will you know? They can just merely sit up there and say, these people are dishonest anyway. They're living against the law right now. They're not hooked to the sewers. Some are having garden hoses providing them water, and extension cords providing electricity. That's illegal. So you think they're going to say, this is this different house? No. It looks the same. Might as well be the same. So there's a lot of things that are going to pose problems.
Okay, let's wrap it up now. You're,
Okay. Let's see.
Your time is up.
yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a whole lot more. I'll have to write a
Thank you for
letter.
your comments. McKinley Barnes.
Hi. I want to speak about two different
I'm
things.
sorry,
One,
your name and address. Do you live in the city?
I do not live in the city. I have lived in the city, but I currently live in the unincorporated area. I've been in this area for over a decade, and I work in the solar industry for California Solar Electric here in town. Two things. I think that the 1 year is preferred over 3 years because I think there probably are homeowners who would be benefited by having the ability to have additional income, help them with their living expenses in a home, and if they commit to having one tiny home and then that tiny home owner's mother who lives in Spokane has a stroke and that person has to move to help their mother, then there's no more income potential for that homeowner for 2 more years or however long. So there's that. Because I work in the solar industry, I want to speak a little to this utility requirement or utility conversation. I made a call today to Southern California Edison's local planning division. Spoke with Wendy. These are the things that I drew from her. There would need to be a separate address. That can be a suite number or an apartment number, on the same parcel where there's already a home. There would be just one interconnection point for Southern California Edison to come into the property. There would need to be a secondary meter. That secondary meter would be attached to the main house, alongside, above, next to, below the current permanent meter. Permanent meters are attached to permanent structures. So then the panel would need to be changed. There would have to be a panel upgrade or a replacement. There would either be a secondary sub-panel added to serve that meter, the second meter, or a panel with two, it's like a double-socketed panel, so there's an expense there. Of course, an electrician would need to be hired to take care of that. The cost of this to the homeowner would vary greatly, especially in this conversation about the POW or whatever whenever they're. So there would be trenching from the secondary permanent meter to wherever this tiny structure would be, tiny home would be, and I guess then that would be underground. So there's the cost of the upgrade to the panel or second panel. There's the cost of trenching. There's the cost of that other permit if this is fresh ground, and whether the service is overhead or underground coming into the property. So just wanted to offer that information.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to speak on this topic?
Again, I'd like to express.
Please tell us who you are and where you live.
My name is Lise Martin. I live at 311 North Signal Street in Ojai. I was here 2 weeks ago. I am so grateful to each and every one of you for all the time that you put in on this panel. I'm just beyond grateful for your service to the community, and I want to speak in favor of the tiny house. I know that for some of you, it may not be your preference, but I do think that I've been blessed to be in some of these tiny houses that are created by people who have visions, and they are of the highest integrity, and they are wonderful opportunities for alternative housing. I'm very concerned about Ojai and about how we create a variety of wonderful housing. I bought in 2001, and Ojai is village mixed use, but it was an award-winning plan that attracted me to buying downtown. And since then, there have been so many different changes. My side yard setbacks have gone from 5 feet to 10%, which is 7.5 feet, maximum of 10. I don't even know if I'll have the right, like you said, lot size to be able to have a tiny house. But I just want to encourage you, because I really feel like you've put a lot of time and energy into this. You've done a wonderful job. And there are going to be more and more people coming in and doing vision work through Ojai City's council, creating the opportunity with Carnegie Mellon for all of us to, from the grassroots up, serve our community with a vision and with dealing with water scarcity and affordable housing. I say for those who are willing to do this and to put the money into the proper way to do it, that you all are encouraging us to do, that I think it could be a win-win situation. I don't see how it could be a liability to you, because we are a small community, we know our neighbors, we engage with them, and we create consensus creatively together. I just encourage you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wish to speak on this topic? All right, we'll close the public hearing and go back into deliberations as a commission. I do have one other question for staff, I guess maybe for the city attorney. We have primarily discussed the situation tonight where the property owner and the tiny home owner are two different people. And clearly the prohibition on excessive movement or excessive frequency of movement, whatever, applies to that situation. Is there any corresponding restriction on a movable tiny home that is owned by the parcel owner?
The same restriction applies.
Okay, so the
As
parcel,
presently phrased.
the parcel owner could purchase and move the movable tiny home onto the property, and if for some reason, other than, say, a casualty loss, I don't know if that even applies.
The existing portions of the code that allow rebuilding of things that are lost in disaster continue to apply. You can rebuild what's burned down. That's fine. with
Okay,
some
rebuilt
rules.
isn't exactly the same kind of thing if you're talking about a trailer.
Well, it rebuilds replace perhaps. I think that situation, the existing provisions of the code that apply in disaster losses would apply, and you'd be able to
Replace what was
replace
lost.
what you had. But
Okay.
So I wouldn't worry about that particular scenario.
Okay.
But to answer perhaps the other scenario, if a property owner simply moves their tiny house off the property for any reason short of a casualty loss, then they wouldn't be able to put it back during the period.
Could they move the same tiny house, movable tiny house, back onto the property?
If it's the exact same one as presently phrased, that would be allowed. We could block that.
So a
revising it.
parcel owner could create the environment for a movable tiny home, deck, pad, whatever, rent it out for some period on a timeshare basis, let's say, And
Not-
then,
it-
and
minimum
then
30 days.
some period during the calendar year, the parcel owner decides it would be fun to take this thing to Mammoth and live there for a couple of weeks.
Now,
And then come back to Ojai and back it onto the property again. Would that be legal under this proposed ordinance?
As presently phrased, yes,
Okay?
provided they can prove it's the same one.
yeah, it's very unlikely.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how much work it is.
Well, yeah, I know, but I do, okay, and there are professionals that do, and believe me, it's not that easy to do.
Not that easy
No,
to put a movable
to move
home
them
in a
and
backyard.
to take them, the tiny home community, if you familiarize yourself with the product and the community, they're not RVs. And that's why they have a definition in of themselves. They are made classified as RVs because of the nature of the frame, but they're not RVs. People don't gallivant all over the country with these. They do for shows or things like that, but generally people are looking to place them to live in them, okay, for a period of time. And the RV is more suited to traveling the country.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed.
you know, it's very unlikely that someone would pay the expense of taking one of these out of their fully hooked up situation on a joyride for 2 weeks. The likelihood of that is,
Probably less expensive to stay in a hotel.
yeah, you would,
Might well be. I don't know. I
So-
mean, when I spoke with the county tax assessor, they said an object of this sort is classified by the county, one, as personal property, not as real estate, which I think we've all understood up to now. That's why it doesn't add to the city's tax rolls. You don't pay property tax on it. You pay personal property tax like you would on any other movable or moving vehicle. It's part of registration and getting a license plate tag every year. But I would ask, and so that's a very different kind of situation. I would ask, in the opinion of the city attorney, if you have a movable tiny home, you place it on your property, and you take the wheels off, put some jacks or even a permanent structure with cinder blocks, is it still a movable tiny home? Or is it now a permanent structure? Does it retain its license plate and its personal property tax characteristics as opposed to becoming a permanent residence like any other ADU and its real estate tax?
It would continue to be a movable tiny house, but with the wheels removed, my opinion, and I'm not the county, but my opinion is that it would then become part of the real estate. If you took the wheels off and affixed it to the ground, cemented it in, or bolted it in, then my opinion is that it would be at that point affixed to the realty, and then it would become part of the real property, subject to reassessment by the assessor, and thus subject to property taxes and associated taxes. The county so far seems to be sort of agreeing, sort of not with that one. They punted a little bit when staff asked them that question.
Yeah.
Mostly punting to, well, we want to see the facts when a particular thing comes in. So I can't guarantee exactly how the county will treat it, but that's how my view would be. It wouldn't become permanent, though. That's something different, because they could then unbolt it, cut the cement, and put the wheels back on and move it off.
Or just remove the deck and put the wheels back on and move it off?
Right.
Or not even take the wheels off?
Well,
Just put a deck around it?
if you didn't take the wheels off, then it's not affixed to the realty, then it remains personal property, not
Not real estate.
Yeah. And that's where I agree with the county, everyone, I think, all are on the same page there. If you keep the wheels on and just skirt it and add the decking to meet our requirements as proposed, then it's not part of the real property.
But even if you take the wheels off, it's still movable.
Right.
Do you continue
There's no way to permanently disable
Do you
it.
continue to re-register it every year?
If you've taken the wheels off, my opinion, although again, I'm not the DMV, my opinion is that it would not be subject to that requirement anymore, because it
Right,
would be
because it's-
affixed to the land.
and also that permit is required for
Maybe it's a
operation on
non-operating
state
permit,
highways,
yeah.
yeah, and it's not, yeah.
You might, if I was a tiny
You can
house.
unregister your vehicle,
Condition
you
is
just,
my point.
Yes, it is. It remains reversible. That's the nature of movable tiny homes.
Okay,
Short of bolting, not even bolting it, short of digging up, I guess, a permanent foundation or something rather extreme, yes, everything remains reversible. That's, I think, one of the advocates' points, and that's a point for the commission and the council to consider. And the other point is noted by Commissioner Jagiello is that the DMV licensure is tied to using it on the roads, not tied to existence. So if you took the wheels off or kept the wheels on but never moved it off the property, you wouldn't.
it's still a parked
Whether or not the
trailer
DMV
as
will-
far as the DMV is concerned.
Right, whether or not the DMV would require it with respect to their law, if you don't take it on the roads, you wouldn't be triggering the need for it. Although I'll let the DMV enforce their laws.
Well, there's a classification for a vehicle that you're not moving.
Planned and non-operation.
Planned non-operation,
Right.
yeah.
And
It's,
so-
it's one of the lines on your
It's a line on
registration every
registry. So
year.
for example, the typical tiny house owner who has, it's on wheels, it's registered with the DMV, they move it onto a property, they take off the wheels, they put the decking on, they fix it to the realty, but they intend to have the option at some point in the future. If they're smart, they would register it every year as planned non-operation. And the city would leave it to the DMV to enforce their laws.
Okay, okay. Before we get out of this entire thing, and I should have said this perhaps as part of the public hearing, but we did receive, and I presume all the commissioners have read, various communications from private citizens, both for and against, or in the case of Mr. Miley, suggesting an alternative to ANSI standards for ADUs. But my understanding, and I don't wish to speak for him, my understanding was that what he talked about, and we all remember the models he brought in and that sort of thing, those are objects that are permanently affixed.
It's a different topic.
there were 3 different models, as
They're
I can remember.
manufactured, they're manufactured homes, but they're permanently affixed to the real estate.
There were 3 different models, and there was one that was still under the ANSI code, one of the models of the 3.
But was it movable
Well,
in the same sense that we're talking about?
Yeah, everything that's built on a frame that you could put wheels on it, that you move from one location to another, including a modular home, can be removed again and moved again. Modular homes can be moved,
Yeah.
even though they're under a different
Stick-built
code.
homes can be can be
Exactly,
moved.
but modulars are built on a frame as well, and that frame sits on a foundation in the cases of modular, but they could jack up that frame, and it's designed to put wheels back on it and move it. So, but that's a different category, and they are totally lawfully.
How is the category different?
Well,
Because it's
modulars
built to a
are.
different set of
bu-
standards
it
than
is.
ANSI?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, the HUD standards, I believe, the modular homes are.
State has created a different set of standards for modular homes than for tiny homes. Well, actually,
Okay.
there are no state standards for tiny homes. We're creating standards.
Okay, then perhaps I was correct in not speaking for Mr. Miley, but trying to characterize his point was that there is another category besides California building standards and ANSI standards that might be, in his opinion, a better choice for a movable tiny home or even an immovable or mostly not movable tiny home. Would that be a
Well, my
fair
con-
statement of?
That is, but my contention here is we're asked by the city council to look at this ordinance on
Right.
these types of tiny homes. And that's really what our focus is.
And that-
Yes, there are
okay.
other alternatives, and I think they should be looked at, and we should look at those, but maybe at another time. I mean, to get this ordinance, that we're asked to review, back either not to, or to the city council, I think is our.
I agree with you. That is our charge today.
So, Mr. Chair, if I could break in.
Yes, Mr.
I
Murphy.
realize this is a learned discussion about these things, but I think this is a really bad ordinance. I think that we should recommend to the city council that they not approve it. So I would like to make a motion to that effect, that we basically tell the city council not to consider this amendment at all, and that it not be included in the municipal code.
Response? Well, for purposes of discussion, I'll second the motion. Let's discuss it.
Well, I think you take a vote because I disagree.
Well, I just think we've wasted an enormous amount of staff time, commission time on this, and I don't see us reaching any resolution on it that would really be something we want to add to the Ojai Municipal Code.
I have to agree at this point. I don't see the advantage of parked trailers in backyards adding to the unique characteristics of the community, let's call it that.
That's a good way to put it.
And then I'd like to.
In particular, if we're
add-
talking composting toilets, which I think we've established in many
Right.
cases. And in this case, I think that's what there is, but I don't know.
No, there is not there.
That's
Then
illegal.
if that's
So
as a
that's out of the
discussion,
question.
I would like to then read something I prepared, especially if this is a final vote on
We're
something.
discussing
I understand,
his motion, right.
and I'm going
Yeah.
to read why I believe I'm against his
Okay,
motion.
that's valid
And-
discussion.
And I'd like to hand it out to everyone and talk about a couple of things. One, I wanted to address a few comments, Wendy, that you made. First of all, Sherry has one already. Yeah, I get one. Tiny homes was introduced by me, not by some caravan that came into town. And the reason it was introduced is because of what I'm about to read, because of the economic feasibility and the possibility that it gives to affordable housing situations. So that's the reason, okay? I just wanted to clarify that. Whether you agree with me or not. Sorry, this is not a discussion. I'm just commenting on what you have to say. The other thing is that all ordinances are difficult. I've been on this commission for over almost 5 years, and I've never done an ordinance that was simple, ever. And we constantly, you've been here many times, so for you to say that is kind of disingenuous. We're constantly asking the attorney, we're constantly asking staff to clarify, because they're the experts, okay? We're volunteers. We're professionals in what we do, but we have to get clarification. And especially if it's a new ordinance and something that's different, we need more clarification. That doesn't mean it's not good or it's not right for the community, just because we're asking questions and clarifying. So I just wanted to make that point. With that said, I want to tell you why I'm in support of tiny homes. Tiny home living is a lifestyle choice and is not for everyone. It's certainly not a panacea to solve our housing crisis. There is a very small percentage of properties in Ojai that are suited for their placement. These homes can only be placed in the rear yard, and they must meet all setback and lot coverage requirements that any ADU would have to meet. Once the wheels are removed, the steel chassis skirted, and the exterior deck is attached, there would be no other distinguishing characteristics between a tiny home on wheels and one on a foundation. Period. As an added benefit, they would be very challenging to move, thereby encouraging more permanent residencies. With that said, the reason to consider tiny homes built to the ANSI standard and that also adapt the emergency and rescue opening codes that add for safety as an ADU option are purely economic. Buying a tiny home avoids having to hire an architect, a contractor, multiple engineers to design, build, draft, and submit plans, which would result in substantial reduced fees. In addition, there is a benefit of economy of scale that results from having these types of homes manufactured nationwide, giving one the ability to buy them used from different and lower economic marketplaces, thereby reducing the cost significantly. There are some very nice used tiny homes for sale for $20,000 to $40,000, and you can look them up at tinyhomeslistings.com. These cost-saving benefits should not be marginalized. This is why it was introduced in the first place. This is not for the rich and famous. This is for the people who need an economic viable option for living. And the ability to put a tiny home in your backyard empowers a property owner to implement a very reasonable and cost-effective housing solution to meet their needs, whether it's for aging parents, a caretaker, adult children, or for a creative artsy friend that simply can't afford to live here without some kind of assistance. So that is my reasoning. I think it's economically viable, and from physically, they are no different once they're placed in the backyard than any stick-built home. So I actually believe that tiny homes on wheels are a viable, affordable housing option and should be strongly considered by the City Council as legal ADUs in the city of Ojai.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chester.
No.
No.
Public hearing is closed. We're now deliberating. Any other comments from the commissioners? My personal feeling is that we're still talking about trailers. And I think that we should not be encouraging the infusion of trailers into our residential neighborhoods.
Okay, we have a motion on the table.
The tax assessor says this is a parked trailer. Doesn't matter if you take the wheels off or leave the wheels on. It doesn't matter if you put it on concrete blocks or jacks. It's a parked trailer. And I don't think that's the kind of environment that we want to encourage in the city. So if there, any other discussion? Bobby?
Well, I started out pretty much against these things, but I think there are other things to consider. I think that, you know, if you look at these pictures, and there are a million different kinds of tiny houses.
This is, by the way, not a legal residence.
Yes.
This is in unincorporated county. It is not legal in the county
I
of
know
Ventura
that.
either.
I'm
Okay.
not saying that. What I'm saying is that the original ADU ordinance that we were given, the packet that we were given, was a little cottage shown. I think that was the intention of the ADU legislation, is to be able to put something, and Senator Wachowski said this himself, that empowered the homeowner, that deregulated the whole process. The whole process needs work. And I don't think that we're going to wind up with a lot of them because they don't fit on most properties in the city of Ojai. They will fit in more places in the unincorporated area because they're bigger. But they are the intention of the original ADU ordinance, which is a little cottage. It's not a big, expensive, full-blown house in your backyard. It's something for your kid to live in. It's something for, you know, your mom to live in. And I've done a lot of reading about different places and different people and different ways that these have been used and where they've shown up. And I think it's worth exploring as an alternative. I think that, you know, we're probably going to start to see a little bit of work being done in terms of how our building and planning fees are structured. It's an area that's really gone amok, and it's made building impossible for a normal person in Ojai. It's a great idea to think everybody can just build something. I'm telling you that $30,000 before the shovel goes into the ground is an untenable amount, and I designed it myself. So I think that if you can skirt those issues, they should be skirted, because the state of California and the city of Ojai has just over-regulated absolutely everything and made it really impossible for a normal individual to build anything at this point in time. So I think that we have to look at different alternatives. This is not the answer to affordable housing. That's another issue that's going to make people angry, but in order to actually get good affordable housing in this town is a whole separate thing. But this is empowerment for a homeowner, and that's the intention. If you listen to Senator Wojciechowski, who wrote the ordinance, who wrote all the legislation for the ADU, that is the intention, is to empower the homeowner and to deregulate this process.
You say it, I'm sorry, you say it's not the answer to affordable housing. What is it
It's
the
a
answer?
small, it's an answer to, it's a small individual way that you can do something on your own property, but you're not going to be able to fit enough of them to really answer the affordable housing problem for the city as a whole and for the requirements the state has for the number of units they want us to do. But what it does is it gives a homeowner at least an opportunity. Affordable housing is not going to be done by people putting housing in their backyards of any kind, whether it's built, whether it's this. That's not how it's going to work. It's going to be density, and it's going to be probably 3 stories. It's the only way you can do it. You can build it beautifully. You can build it in a contained area so that it's not going to affect your views. But what this does is empowers a homeowner to at least have a choice. I have children who can't afford to live in the city of Ojai unless they live with me, and that's what we've done. Other people are in the same situation. They may want their sister to live with them. They may want their mother to live with them. Some people may need a caregiver to live with them. And this gives you an option. I think it's worth exploring. I think we need to explore all these options because we are in a fairly dire situation with our building.
Okay,
I think I'm ready for a vote.
Okay.
yep.
There's a
Let's
motion
have
on
a
the
roll
table.
call on the motion that we recommend to the city council not to adopt this ordinance.
Merck,
Yes.
Corbin,
No.
Nolan,
No.
Quillisi,
Yes?
Jagiello.
No.
Motion fails.
Okay,
I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to make a motion. Let's see, where's the last page of the staff report? Was it right here? Okay. I make a motion to recommend that the city council
Text amendment.
I recommend that the city council adopt the ordinance with these changes. I'd like to change the minimum square footage to 150 square feet, and I agree with with Commissioner Corbin that we should go back to the 1-year timeframe.
And for staff's clarification, did you intend to add the decking
That's what I was
requirement?
going to say.
Yes, and to add my recommendation is an 8 by 10, because that's a reasonable size, minimum
80 square
size
foot
deck,
deck.
80 square foot deck attached.
skirting is already in here?
Yes, skirting is already in there. 80 square foot.
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
And this is about the 1 year. Would you mind explaining your
Well, my
process,
position,
yeah.
I agree with Commissioner Corbin on it. And it's like, if we're going to dive into this, let's just dive into it. Let's not penalize somebody and assume all the worst from the get-go. I know the difficulty of moving these things. And the idea of them being placed, put a deck on them, skirted, all the utilities, all the effort that it takes to hook these up, is going to be deterrent enough, to not want to move them again. So I'm open to either way, but I kind of agree that if we're going to go down this road, let's not give any more, restrictions than necessary.
I'm a little reticent about the exact size on the decking just because it may not fit. I'd
Confirm.
almost
Well,
rather
we just-
do it on
We
2
did
sides.
Well, we
or-
did square footage, and we'll do, on one side, 80 square feet.
Well, can it be divided in 2 sides, 80 square feet?
Oh, yeah, and I don't care about the sides.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think if you so it doesn't matter, as long as
A
it.
little, yeah, it might need to be a little
Yeah,
bit on each side,
I
so
like-
that it meets the ground nicely.
Yes. So I think you put a square footage on that at 80 square feet. So that's my
So
motion.
The ordinance has stated with the change to the minimum size and adding the decking of 80 square feet.
And going back to the 1 year.
Back to 1 year.
There's one other item that we believe there may be an assumption that is in the ordinance, but it's not currently, which is the rear yard requirement. There's not currently one in the ordinance. It's something that can be added, that it would
Saying
only
if
be allowed
there's
in
a
the rear yard.
large front yard, I know there's some of those on Park, for
Oh,
example.
the rear yard,
Put this in the front yard?
No.
As written,
As presently written, it sounds like that wishes, the
right.
commission
Yes,
wishes to
no, I would,
change
I
that.
would
So
like to add
add that
in the
to your-
rear of the property only, yes.
Yes.
I do not want them in the front yard setbacks.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
so
think
that's
it
the
should be
fourth change.
consistent with our ADU
Right.
ordinance.
The AD ordinance doesn't prohibit them in the rear yard. They can be,
In the front too?
not in the front setback, outside the setback, but in the front. If you had a large lot, you could
Yeah,
build to the
I
front of your
believe, I
house.
believe these are more
think
suited
this
to
should
be in the
be-
rear yard of a home. And so,
That's easily added.
yes.
Rear
okay,
yard only.
Yeah.
All right, we have a motion on the table. Is there a second?
I'll second the motion.
Any discussion of the motion?
I'd like to invoke Mr. Highsmith's comment that 20 years from now, we may regret this.
We could put a sunset clause on it.
Would you like to make an amendment to the motion to put a sunset clause on it?
Sure. Why don't we look at it in 5 years?
That's not exactly a sunset. That's just a review. Are you saying
It ends?
a sunset clause says after a certain period of time, this piece of the law no longer is valid? Is that what you would like to do?
I would,
As an
I
amendment
would
to
like
the
to have it reviewed in 5 years.
Well, let the city council,
They can deal
this
with
all has
that.
to get vetted out through the city
Perfect.
council. So we're not making the final decision here. So there are some recommendations that I made in the past. I'm also open, and I'm not sure if I'm adding this, we're having a discussion, so I'm not adding this to the motion.
Deliberating,
We're
yeah.
deliberating. But in the past, I don't have a problem with limiting it to a certain amount of permits per year.
We talked about that.
Yeah, and so I'd be open to that discussion. And that also can, even though I think it's going to be self-limiting by itself, because if you have to meet all those setback requirements, it's going to
And
be.
get it in.
It's going to be enough. So I think I'd rather let that be vetted out through the city council myself.
You have something more? Okay, any other discussion? Then let's call the roll. This is for the
Oh,
recommendation that we recommend to the city council, they accept the ordinance, that they pass the ordinance, approve the ordinance with the 3 changes noted.
4 changes.
3?
Four.
Oh.
We added the rear yard.
Minimum
the rear yard.
size,
To 150.
Rear yard only,
rear yard only,
1 year.
Time,
1
the
year.
1 year requirement
And
and
80
the
square feet.
decking.
Yeah,
and 80 square feet of decking, or more, I presume.
Somewhere.
minimum.
Yeah,
80
minimum.
square feet.
Okay, Sherry?
Mark,
No.
Corbin,
Yes.
Nolan,
Yes.
Quillisi,
No.
Jagiello.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Does this mean we don't have to discuss
You're
this
right.
anymore?
We don't have to do it anymore. That's the one benefit.
It goes up to the
Just
council.
stop banging our heads
Goes to
against
the
the
city
wall.
council.
Unless they send it back to us.
I don't think they will.
They have their own, let them.
That's right. Okay, we have no discussion items this evening. Let's go to item 4, informational items, future agenda items. Mr. Vega.
Thank you. So, future agenda items, we made a couple changes to the format of the document here to note that 3 of the items that had been listed as future items are actually have been reviewed by the Planning Commission and are pending City Council review, which are the water-wise development standards, solar guidelines, design guidelines, and now after today, tiny homes will be on that list as well. So there's a couple of items still pending review by the Planning Commission that have been directed by council, which are the hedges, fences and walls discussion. Although I should note that we're planning to take that to the council soon, in the next couple of meetings for specific direction. And then the other item would be the Planning Commission code cleanup, Title 10 cleanup. So just one other point. So we have the meeting on August 15th, and we have a joint session with council scheduled for September 11th. So the one item listed on August 15th is to discuss the items to take to the joint meeting. And the item that we've recommended to take at that time is the design guidelines and landscape standards items, so that Planning Commission can get clarification and direction from the council at the joint meeting.
I'm curious. I understand the design guidelines thing. We talked about that
Right.
with Mr. Blatz at the end of the last meeting.
Mhm.
What is it that we're looking for in landscape standards to request, I guess, guidance from the city council?
Yeah. One of the issues that has come up recently, I want to say in May, I believe one of the council members had asked if the Planning Commission and staff would look at the Santa Barbara landscape standards and use those as kind of a guide and then develop some standards for the city of Ojai. But there hasn't been full council direction to do that yet.
Does fences, hedges fall under those landscape standards?
That's a separate item, and
I know it's a separate item on this page.
oh, right.
Is that part of landscape standards?
No, we expect those will be two very different discussions. The fences, hedges, and walls stems from passionate discussions that were held at the council in November and October of 2015 regarding
Many years
hedge height
past, yes.
and fence height standards. And certainly they're related. They're both about the area of the property.
But their dimensions.
Right. Particularly, we expect that to be a discussion of height and height standards. But of course, it's not limited to that. It could be opened up to broader things.
I'm just curious, what is there, and Kathy, you're a landscape architect, so what is there in landscape standards in the code right now that requires clarification?
I'm not sure exactly what they were pinpointing, but I had a question. Was the Santa Barbara standards in relation to fire and landscape, or was it just broad stroke, or do we know? Or I guess we can find out, right?
Yeah,
At the joint meeting.
I think that's the
Okay.
question at this point, was there was a document referenced, and the council member had said, I'm going to ask Planning Commission and staff to look at this. But the full council hadn't asked for it, and we
Okay.
have not seen that document.
I think it might be this plant list that they have, but that you can use for fire, but
I think
we'll
so.
find out.
Recommended and discouraged
Yeah.
species of plants
Yeah.
for.
And if it is that, Ventura County has a really good one also. But I know that they're updating their list, so who knows? But we'll find out. We'll wait and see what they
Yeah.
say.
Those are just the two
I'm
items
just
that.
projecting
Just
here.
didn't understand what that was about,
Yeah.
Yeah.
okay?
Sure.
We have a couple of upcoming DRPs,
Mhm.
the code cleanup for sure. And I guess we did have a little bit of discussion of design guidelines toward the end of our last meeting. And I think it would be good to get some guidance from the full council on what they'd like to have us do there. I anticipate it's going to require a lot of reading and recommending within our commission to discuss these things. Yes, please.
I'm not sure if this is the correct time, but we are talking about future agenda items. I wanted to add something for the future, and basically, it's about our city's speed limit on. City's what? Speed limit on roads. And basically, there's a movement called 20 is plenty, 20 miles per hour, or potentially even 25 miles per hour. But the research and referencing was actually put in our master plan document for complete streets. So it's something that I would like to bring to our planning commission and essentially have us make a recommendation after looking at the research and
Okay.
move that on to city council.
Mr. Vega, can we add city speed limit to that
Yes.
Bottom list there, please.
We will add it, and then I just want to note that I believe Councilmember Francina requested that that be discussed by council to see if
she
there's
did.
interest. And I want to say it was tentatively scheduled for late October, but I'm sure
Okay.
that's far enough out that that may change.
But for the record, we'll keep it on this
We'll
list
keep it on
as
here.
well, so
Okay.
that we don't forget it.
Right.
Okay?
We'll do that.
So the only agenda item now, unless one of these DRPs is completed within the next week or so to allow noticing, then we're going to get together to talk about what do we look to the council for guidance 2 weeks hence.
Yeah, I was thinking if the DRPs didn't come through, I don't know if you're prepared to start on the planning commission code cleanup, or if we still need to game plan. Maybe the discussion is just a game plan for that. but that's probably the one item that's still pending.
That is something that the council has already requested that we do. I'm not sure that requesting the council to authorize a consultant is a part of the solution to that problem. I'd like to see the commission take on the task of cleaning up the rules that the commission lives by. Something else that we could discuss, and that comes from the fact that the BAB has a meeting a week hence. And they are continuing Title IX cleanup. In their first round of cleanup in Title IX, they said, well, they had like 7 or 8 chapters of Title IX, and 2 or 3 of them, they said, this really belongs in Title X. I have a feeling that when the BAB meets next week, we may see more of that. And so a week hence, I would at least like to hear from staff what the BAB recommends as more things in our job jar when we get to Title X code cleanup.
We can bring that list back of recommendations.
Okay, and see if we agree with it, or think it really ought to be BAB business or somebody else's. Anything else that we'd like to have discussed 2 weeks hence? All right? Thank you very much. And by the way, I want to compliment the staff on the way that you have arranged this list of pending projects and other things, and provided us with status. Because when they're just short names of topics, some of us weren't here when the whole thing started, or we've forgotten in the case of us old folks, and we don't know where we stand with the council on certain things. So that was very useful to me, and I appreciate it. Let's go on to the next topic, the liaison schedule. We don't have anything at the moment of past meetings to be reported on. The next one is next week, the Building Appeals Board, and then the MAC meeting 2 weeks, 3 weeks hence almost.
Building appeals is on video.
Yes.
I don't know if it is. I suspect it is. I think
Says it is.
Jeremy's here doing, or if not Jeremy here, then somebody in front. Oh, James, okay.
Yeah, I run the video.
Somebody's
for that. So
running.
They're available. They're not as nicely bookmarked as when Sherry does them.
You can find them online.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are
so
they
on the same
Granicus or
page,
YouTube or
on
both?
Granicus, you can select the Building Appeals Board, and then it'll have the archive on there.
Yeah. As a former Building Appeals Board member, I attend most of their meetings, just out of interest. But it's your job to report back on it, and I'll look forward to your report. Okay? And now we're down to the latest and greatest, the save the best for last, our city council liaison, Mr. Blatz.
Well, another interesting night in front of the Planning Commission, and good job. I mean, it was well deliberated, and you came to a conclusion, and we're going to get it now, and it'll rise to the top again, and we'll hear all the comments from the public, and then we'll debate it. And eventually, we'll either have an ordinance or we won't. So Thank you very much. You put a lot of time into that. And I can report back, having been here for the discussions at the last meeting and this meeting, I can report back to the city council, for those that haven't watched the meeting, an accurate statement of what took place that you don't glean from simply seeing minutes. So thank you all for your efforts in that. I don't know anything about the request to go to Santa Barbara to look at plants, or to, what is that about, James?
It was, I think Councilmember Haney had a Santa Barbara guideline that he said he wanted to be discussed, but I didn't see that the whole council requested it, which is why
Right.
we're saying let's talk about it at the joint meeting.
I remember him talking about something, but I don't ever believe the council directed staff to do anything. The other thing that I was wondering about, because I didn't see it this month, was the last meeting there was an extensive discussion on coming back to the council for permission or authorization to extend your scope of looking at what had been asked by Councilman Wyrick to consider extending the guidelines further to the east. And is that planning to come back to us? We don't have another meeting until the 28th, I believe.
Yeah, that's my thought. I spoke with Chair Closey about this, was that could also be a good item to bring to the joint session.
Okay.
And have the discussion with both bodies of what.
It's an important topic, and I don't want it to get lost somewhere, that's
Yeah.
all.
We have it on our list for the September 11th joint
Okay.
session.
As you know, having been a part of this body as well as on the council now, we have arcade design guidelines, arcade plaza design guidelines, East End design guidelines, and then there's something called city core or something else, which is an overlay. Some of the others may overlay each other as well. And we may want to try to provide more clarity in that area for people.
And I don't disagree with that. I think it's a good idea. Because quite frankly, after looking at the packet that you looked at last month, I didn't, when we were talking about extending the plaza guidelines to the east, I wasn't thinking that there might also be redevelopment guidelines or core guidelines.
That's right, that's redevelopment.
Right, and then you had the East End guidelines. So I'm a little confused as to what Ryrick really was requesting you guys to look at, other than, should we have guidelines? But if so, which ones? And are there overlapping guidelines that maybe we don't need? So I think it's a good idea that the council is made aware of that so that we can direct it back to you.
Well, I made a request to do that matrix where we had kind of
Right.
compared all the guidelines and tried to take out of them all the common ones that were similar
Yeah.
to each one, and then to identify the ones that were not, to see why they're not.
Right.
And so what we're saying is that we're putting that off until we get to get it to city council first.
So the idea with that and the landscape standards is, rather than taking a request back to council to designate, or, do you want to have this full design guideline discussion, or just that expanding the one and then coming back and kind of going back and forth? That at the joint session with both bodies there, it can be, you can explain what you saw with the design guidelines and the issues you see, and we would
The
know
reason for that, yeah.
Yeah, and the matrix, I agree. I think it is.
Well, that's a way to just
necessary.
sort out everything.
Yeah.
We need to sort it out because it's too complicated.
And to provide direction on it.
And the council as a whole, and particularly the mayor, is very cognizant or concerned with the amount of work that we give to staff. And if we sent something to you guys to look at, thinking it was going to be one thing, and it turns into a matrix, which I happen to think is an excellent idea, and that wasn't anticipated, and that's going to require more time, I think it needs to come back to the council, because it's up to the council to determine how much staff time we want to put into it.
Exactly. Okay.
I guess this extension of the plaza guidelines to the east may be what set off this flurry of emails about what is permitted on PL property, because you move to the east from the plaza and you hit the school district property,
Well,
which is PL.
and it may be, Chair Quillisi, but I think that all of the flurry of emails that I've seen with regard to the PL has to do with the project on the other side, across
Back side of the landmark?
No, it's either Aliso, I think it's Aliso Street, where Black Mountain Oil Company used to be located. Do you know that building? It's across the street from the school,
Yeah. The one,
from the Arc. That's the one that I think is raised, because there's been some question, particularly raised by Councilman Wyrick, as to whether or not there's a proposal for a commercial property to go in there, I think. I'm not positive about that. Hasn't come before you guys or us.
Yeah.
But he's concerned as to what should be allowed there. Because, as I recall, he says it's PL, and if something else goes in there, it's not allowed. That's what I've seen in the
Okay,
emails.
I'm
Maybe there's something
confused
else.
as to the parcel that's under
Yeah,
discussion.
it's
but
the one that I've
that's
seen
okay.
where there's a lot of going back and forth. Yeah. That's the one I'm
Oh,
thinking of.
Kenyatta and Aliso.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, it's Kenyatta and Aliso.
okay. So that's completely separate
Oh.
from extending plaza guidelines. to the
Project.
east.
That discussion has
project.
nothing to do with what was asked for you guys to do.
Okay, okay.
Status of that is that the relevant design review permit was approved by the director via director's exemption after some debate.
Yes,
And
that's correct.
clearly, the broader PL zone questions are something that definitely, I think, the council's going to look at along with this commission.
Right. We haven't had a meeting, so, I don't have anything to
You have a
specifically
meeting next week,
report.
I understand.
What's that?
I understand you have a meeting next week.
Well, I think we have a special meeting on the 7th, next Tuesday. I don't know, is there also a meeting tomorrow? I thought that we were having a meeting on the 2nd, is that?
Well, there's a couple, well, there's the ribbon cutting event
Right, there's a
tomorrow.
the ribbon cutting tomorrow at 11 o'clock in Libby Park has to do with the environmental department of the county and us, because we were able to get grants to have all our mowers and everything electric. So we have the electric mowers, and we're gonna have a ribbon cutting tomorrow at 11.
Yeah, so that's at 11 at Libby Park, and Assemblymember Limon, and I think Board of Supervisor will be there as well.
Yeah, I think Supervisor Bennett will be there. But there was talk about having a meeting tomorrow, but I don't think that ever materialized.
Yeah, the mayor called the special meeting not for tomorrow, but instead for next Tuesday at 6 p.m.?
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock,
Yeah,
here.
right.
It's a bevy of water issues I expect to be on the
It
agenda.
has to do with water issues, that's the only thing. And usually, it would be 6 o'clock prior to a regular meeting, but we don't have a regular meeting, so he called it for Tuesday anyway.
6 o'clock on the 7th.
Yeah. It is 6, I believe, isn't it?
I believe that's
Not
correct.
7, yeah. Any questions of me? No? Well, it's nice to see you again. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for all your hard work. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you very much. Before we adjourn, I wanted to make an announcement that Monday, the mayor and I and council member Francina had the opportunity to interview 2 applicants for the open seat on the Planning Commission. And we have determined by a vote of 3-0 to recommend one of those applicants for the position on the Planning Commission. I'm sorry? I can't tell you yet, because the recommendation is to the city council for approval. And so I'd rather not say, other than to say that we felt that this person was extremely qualified for a planning commission type job. Had been an assistant community development director in another city in California, and various other things that added to this person's qualifications. So,
let's guess. Let's play guessing.
I never had met either of these 2 people that we interviewed. One also applied for a slot on the Arts Commission, so who knows? The other folks were doing those others as well. So without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.